The war room was bigger than anything Jake Morrison had ever seen. The walls curved up into darkness above his head, and screens showed star maps that stretched across the entire galaxy. He sat in the back corner, trying to make himself as small as possible in his chair. Jake was 19 years old and felt completely out of place. Around him sat the most important military leaders from 12 different star systems. Their voices filled the room as they argued about battle plans and troop movements. Some spoke in clicks and whistles that his translator struggled to understand. Others communicated through flashing lights on their skin. The human officers looked just as serious as the aliens. Admiral Kate Sullivan sat near the front, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. General Ryan Cooper kept checking his tablet, his face grim. They had been fighting this war for 3 years now, and Jake could see the weight of it in their tired eyes. The enemy was called the Zephyrian Empire. They had been conquering planets across the galaxy, destroying everything in their path. Their ships were fast and deadly. Their soldiers were ruthless. Worst of all, they never took prisoners. When the Zephyrians conquered a world, they killed everyone who lived there. Now they were heading toward Kepler Station. Jake had studied the files about it during his flight to the War Council. Kepler Station was huge, built inside a hollowed-out asteroid. 50 million people lived there, working in mines and factories. They made ships and weapons for the Alliance. More importantly, they had families there. Children played in the recreation areas while their parents worked to keep the war effort going. Jake pulled up the station's details on his small tablet. The pictures showed busy markets, schools, and parks built inside the rock. It looked like a real home, not just a military target. He wondered if the generals saw the same thing when they looked at those images. General Vextar stood up to speak. He was from a race called the Altarians, and his body looked like it was made of living crystal. When he moved, light danced across his surface in patterns that somehow conveyed emotion. Right now, those patterns looked cold and calculating. The Zephyrian fleet will reach Kepler Station in 6 days, General Vextar said. His voice sounded like wind chimes in a storm. We have 3 possible responses to consider. The first plan appeared on the main screen. It showed Alliance ships forming defensive lines around the station. Numbers scrolled beside the formation, showing projected casualties. Jake's stomach dropped when he saw them. 3 million Alliance soldiers would die in the first day of fighting. This plan saves Kepler Station, General Vextar continued, but the cost in ships and personnel would cripple our fleet for years. Admiral Zhikolos spoke next. He was from the Centauri Collective, and his insect-like body clicked and buzzed as he talked. The first plan is wasteful, he said through his translator. We should consider strategic withdrawal. The second plan filled the screen. This one showed the Alliance fleet pulling back to safer positions. Kepler Station was left alone, a small dot surrounded by red enemy markers. The projected casualties for Alliance forces dropped to almost 0. The casualties for Kepler Station's population were listed as 50 million. Jake felt sick. They were talking about letting everyone on the station die. Men, women, children, all of them would be killed when the Zephyrians arrived. The generals discussed it like they were talking about the weather. Kepler Station's industrial capacity can be replaced, Admiral Zhikolos explained. The population, while regrettable to lose, is not militarily essential. We must preserve our fleet for more strategic battles. Jake wanted to stand up and shout that those weren't just numbers on a screen. They were real people with real lives. But he stayed quiet. He was just a cadet. Nobody had asked for his opinion, and nobody wanted to hear it. The third plan was a compromise. Half the fleet would evacuate essential personnel from Kepler Station, while the other half delayed the Zephyrian advance. The numbers showed that they could save about 7 million people. The other 43 million would be left behind to die. Essential personnel, Admiral Sullivan said slowly. Scientists, engineers, military commanders. People we can't replace. Correct, General Vextar replied. The remaining population serves no strategic value. Jake gripped his tablet tighter. On Earth, every person had value. His grandmother used to tell him stories about the old wars, when entire cities were destroyed, but people kept fighting. She said humans never gave up because they fought for each other, not for strategic value. Debate continued for hours. Jake listened to them discuss acceptable losses and strategic priorities. They talked about resource allocation and fleet preservation. What they didn't talk about was the families who would be separated forever. They didn't mention the children, who would never see their parents again. Admiral Sullivan spoke up during a brief pause. All three plans require us to make impossible choices, she said. Either we sacrifice our fleet, sacrifice the civilian population, or sacrifice most of the civilian population. There has to be another way. There is no other way, General. Vextar replied firmly. War requires difficult decisions. We must choose the option that serves the greater good. Jake thought about his training on Earth. The planet was dangerous in ways most aliens couldn't imagine. Hurricanes that could flatten cities. Earthquakes that split the ground open. Wild animals that could kill with a single bite. But humans had learned to survive it all. They adapted. They found solutions that others said were impossible. The aliens were thinking like machines, calculating the best outcome from limited options. But Jake had grown up on a world where the impossible happened every day, where people found ways. To survive against odds that should have killed them all. As the debate raged on, Jake realized something that made his hands shake. The generals were so focused on their three plans that they couldn't see other possibilities. They were trapped by their own logic, unable to think beyond the traditional ways of warfare. He looked around the room at all the experienced commanders and brilliant, tactical minds. They had fought dozens of battles and saved countless worlds. But they had never lived on Earth. They had never learned that. Sometimes the best solution was the one nobody expected. Jake closed his eyes and thought about home. He thought about his grandmother's stories and the lessons he had learned growing up on humanity's dangerous world. Maybe it was time for a Deathworlder's perspective to change how the galaxy fought its wars. The war room had fallen silent, except for the quiet hum of computers and life support systems. Jake could hear his own heartbeat as the final debate wound down. The commanders had been arguing for 6 hours straight, and now they were ready to vote. Admiral Sullivan looked tired as she prepared to call for the decision. Her hands rested flat on the table in front of her, and Jake could see her shoulders trembling slightly. She knew that whatever choice they made, millions of people would die because of it. General Vextar's crystal body had shifted to a deep blue color, which Jake's cultural training told him meant determination. The Altarian had made his position clear. The fleet was more important than any single population center, even one as large as Kepler Station. We will now vote on our response to the Zephyrian advance, Admiral Sullivan announced. Her voice carried the weight of command, but Jake could hear the sadness underneath it. All in favor of Plan Alpha, full fleet engagement to defend Kepler Station. 3 hands went up. Jake counted them quickly. Admiral Sullivan herself, General Cooper, and one of the Centauri commanders whose name Jake couldn't pronounce. That wasn't enough votes to carry the decision. All in favor of Plan Beta, strategic withdrawal and fleet preservation. 5 hands rose this time. General Vextar, Admiral Zhikalos, and 3 other alien commanders. Jake felt his stomach drop. They were going to abandon 50 million people to save their ships. All in favor of Plan Gamma, partial evacuation of essential personnel. 4 more hands went up. The vote was close, but Plan Beta had won. The Alliance fleet would retreat and let the Zephyrians slaughter everyone on Kepler Station. Jake stood up before he could stop himself. His chair scraped against the metal floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire room. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward him. He had never felt so exposed in his entire life. The alien commanders stared at him with expressions he couldn't read. Some looked curious, others annoyed. Admiral Sullivan's face showed pure shock. In 19 years of life and 2 years of military training, Jake had never interrupted a superior officer. "Permission to speak, sir," Jake said. His voice sounded steadier than he felt, which surprised him. Admiral Sullivan blinked several times, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Cadet Morrison, this is not the time for questions. We have reached our decision." Jake's hands were shaking, but he kept them steady at his sides. "With respect, Admiral, I don't think you have considered all the options." The room erupted. Several alien commanders began speaking at once in their native languages. Jake's translator was overwhelmed, producing a jumbled mix of clicks, whistles, and electronic tones. He caught fragments of meaning: inappropriate, out of line, young fool. General Vextar's crystal form shifted to a bright red, which Jake's training said meant anger. "Cadet Morrison, you forget your place. This council is for experienced commanders, not children." "I'm not a child," Jake replied, and was surprised by how calm he sounded. "I'm a human from Earth, and I think that gives me a perspective you might be missing." Admiral Zhukolos clicked his mandibles together in what Jake recognized as dismissive laughter. "Perspective? You have been in military service for barely 2 years. What perspective could you possibly offer?" Jake took a deep breath. This was it. He was either about to save millions of lives or destroy his career. Maybe both. "You're all thinking about this like it's a game of chess," he said, looking around the room at the assembled commanders. "You see pieces on a board that you can move around or sacrifice, but you're missing something important." "And what might that be?" General Vextar asked. His red glow had dimmed slightly, suggesting he was at least willing to listen. Jake moved closer to the holographic display showing Kepler Station and the approaching Zephyrian fleet. The numbers were stark and terrifying. Enemy ships outnumbered the Alliance fleet 3-1. Their weapons were more advanced. Their soldiers were better trained for assault operations. "You're thinking like the Zephyrians expect you to think," Jake said. "They're counting on you to either fight them in space or run away. Those are the only 2 options they've prepared for." Admiral Sullivan leaned forward. "Cadet Morrison, what are you suggesting?" Jake's heart pounded as he realized he had their attention. "I'm suggesting that humans didn't become the dominant species on Earth by fighting fair. We survived because we fought smart." He touched the holographic controls, zooming in on Kepler Station itself. The massive structure filled the display, showing its industrial sections, residential areas, and mining operations. "Look at this place," Jake said. "Really look at it. You see 50 million helpless civilians who need to be evacuated or abandoned. But I see something else. What do you see?" Admiral Sullivan asked quietly. Jake's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "I see 50 million people who grew up hearing stories about Earth's wars. I see mining equipment that can cut through starship hulls. I see industrial fabricators that can make weapons. I see a population that has nowhere to run, which means they'll fight harder than any trained soldier." The room had gone completely quiet. Even the translation devices had stopped their constant chatter. "The Zephyrians are expecting resistance from your fleet," Jake continued. "They're not expecting resistance from the station itself. They're planning to board it and secure it quickly, then use it as a base for their next advance." General Vextar's color had shifted to amber, which Jake hoped meant curiosity rather than anger. "Continue." Jake felt a surge of confidence. "On Earth, we have a saying, Home field advantage. The people on Kepler Station know every corridor, every maintenance shaft, every emergency system. The Zephyrians don't. He manipulated the display to show the station's internal structure. Thousands of levels, millions of rooms, countless ways to move through the asteroid without being detected. You're talking about turning civilians into soldiers, Admiral Jicchio said. That violates every principle of civilized warfare. Civilized warfare? Jake repeated. The Zephyrians don't take prisoners. They kill everyone they capture. How is that civilized? Admiral Sullivan was studying the display with new interest. You're proposing we arm the civilian population. I'm proposing we give them the tools to defend themselves, Jake corrected. And I'm proposing we coordinate with them instead of trying to fight this battle alone. Jake's mind was racing now, seeing possibilities that hadn't existed a few minutes ago. The Zephyrians will expect to fight your fleet in space. They won't expect to fight 50 million angry humans inside a structure they don't understand. It's impossible, General Vextar said, but his color had shifted again, this time to a thoughtful green. Civilians cannot stand against trained assault troops. They don't have to stand against them, Jake replied. They just have to make the Zephyrians' lives miserable until your fleet can pick them off. Jake looked around the room at the assembled commanders. For the first time since he had arrived, he felt like he belonged there. Not because of his rank or his experience, but because he could see something they couldn't. The Zephyrians are about to make the same mistake that every invader in Earth's history has made, he said. They're about to fight humans on human terms. And when that happens, we don't lose. The silence stretched out for long seconds. Jake could see the commanders thinking, considering possibilities they had never imagined before. Finally, Admiral Sullivan spoke. Cadet Morrison, I want you to explain exactly what you have in mind. Jake moved to the center of the war room, his hands steady now as he worked with the holographic controls. The massive display showed Kepler Station in perfect detail, every level and corridor visible in blue light. He could feel the weight of 12 different species' attention focused on him. The first thing you need to understand, Jake began, is that humans think differently about fighting than most other species. When we're cornered, we don't calculate odds or consider strategic retreat. We get angry. Admiral Sullivan watched him carefully. Explain what you mean by angry. Jake highlighted the residential sections of Kepler Station. These people have been living in this asteroid for generations. They've built homes, raised families, created communities. When the Zephyrians come to take that away, they won't just be fighting for the Alliance. They'll be fighting for their children's bedrooms and their neighbors' gardens. General Vextar's crystal form flickered with patterns Jake couldn't interpret. Emotion is not a military strategy, Cadet Morrison. On Earth it is, Jake replied, firmly. Let me tell you about the siege of London during World War III. The enemy had better weapons, more soldiers, and complete air superiority. By every military calculation, the city should have fallen in 3 days. He paused, making sure he had their attention. It held out for 8 months. Do you know why? Enlighten us, Admiral Jekyllos said, his mandibles clicking with what might have been skepticism. Because every man, woman, and teenager in that city turned into a fighter. They used kitchen knives, garden tools, and homemade explosives. They fought from sewers, rooftops, and subway tunnels. The enemy couldn't secure a single block because there were always more defenders hiding in places they never thought to look. Jake manipulated the display to show Kepler Station's industrial areas. Now imagine that same principle, but with mining lasers instead of kitchen knives. With industrial fabricators instead of basement workshops. With 50 million people who have nowhere to retreat. The room was completely silent except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Jake could see the commanders beginning to understand what he was proposing. The Zephyrians will board the station, expecting to face security guards and maybe a few hundred maintenance workers with basic weapons, Jake continued. Instead, they'll face a population that's been preparing for war their entire lives. Preparing? For war? General Cooper asked. They're civilians. Jake smiled for the first time since entering the war room. General, every human child grows up hearing stories about Earth's wars. They play games about fighting aliens. They watch movies about ordinary people becoming heroes. When the real war comes, they already know what to do. He zoomed in on the station's mining operations. These people operate equipment that can cut through solid rock. They work with explosives powerful enough to split asteroids. They maintain fusion reactors and artificial gravity generators. Do you really think they can't figure out how to fight back? Admiral Sullivan leaned forward, studying the display with new interest. You're talking about turning the entire station into a weapon. I'm talking about giving the people the tools they need to defend themselves, Jake corrected. The mining equipment can be modified to breach ship hulls. The fabricators can produce weapons and ammunition. The reactor systems can be overloaded to create massive explosions. General Vextar's color shifted to a deep purple. Even if this were possible, the casualties would be enormous. Civilian populations are not trained for combat. You're right, Jake admitted. A lot of people will die. But they're going to die anyway if we abandon them. At least this way, they die fighting for their homes instead of being slaughtered like animals. Jake turned to face the assembled commanders directly. And here's the beautiful part of the plan. While the Zephyrians are trapped inside the station, fighting for every corridor and every room, your fleet can pick off their ships one by one. Admiral Gicolosi's compound eyes focused on the tactical display. The Zephyrian fleet will be committed to the boarding action. They cannot retreat without losing their assault force. Exactly, Jake said, his excitement growing. They'll have to choose between abandoning their troops or keeping their ships in position to support them. Either way, they lose their tactical advantage. Jake highlighted the station's communication systems. The people inside can coordinate with your fleet. They can tell you when Zephyrian ships are vulnerable. They can guide your targeting systems to hit critical areas. The holographic display shifted to show potential battle scenarios. Jake worked quickly, showing how the civilian resistance could funnel Zephyrian troops into kill zones, how they could use the station's own systems as weapons, how they could provide real-time intelligence to the Alliance fleet. This is unprecedented, General Vextar said. Galactic warfare doctrine has never involved civilian populations to this extent. Maybe that's why you keep losing battles, Jake replied, then immediately regretted his boldness. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. But Admiral Sullivan was nodding thoughtfully. No, Cadet Morrison. You might be right. We've been fighting this war according to rules that the Zephyrians don't follow. Maybe it's time to change our approach. Jake felt a surge of hope. There's something else to consider. The Zephyrians have been conquering worlds for decades. They've never faced organized civilian resistance. They don't know how to handle it. He brought up intelligence reports on previous Zephyrian conquests. Look at their pattern. They either face military forces that they can defeat in conventional battles, or they face helpless civilians that they can slaughter without resistance. They've never dealt with anything in between. Admiral Cooper was studying the reports with growing interest. You're saying they're not prepared for asymmetric warfare. I'm saying they're not prepared for human warfare, Jake corrected. We've been fighting guerrilla wars for thousands of years. It's in our nature. Jake manipulated the display to show Earth's military history. Ancient battles, modern conflicts, all showing the same pattern of smaller forces defeating larger ones through unconventional tactics. Every human knows these stories, Jake said. David and Goliath, the American Revolution, the Warsaw Ghetto, Vietnamese tunnel fighters, Chechen urban warfare. We've been perfecting the art of fighting hopeless battles for our entire history. General Vextar's crystal form was now glowing a soft gold, which Jake hoped meant agreement. You propose to turn 50 million civilians into an army. I propose to let 50 million humans be what they already are, Jake replied. Survivors who refuse to give up. The silence in the room was different now. Instead of skepticism, Jake could sense consideration. The commanders were actually thinking about his proposal. There would be massive logistical challenges, Admiral Zhekalos pointed out. Coordinating with civilian forces, supplying weapons, establishing communication networks. Those are problems we can solve, Admiral Sullivan said. The question is whether this plan can actually work. Jake looked around the room at the most experienced military minds in the galaxy. 2 hours ago, they had been ready to abandon 50 million people to certain death. Now they were considering turning those same people into the key to victory. It can work, Jake said with quiet confidence. But only if we stop thinking like traditional military commanders and start thinking like humans fighting for their home. He paused, then added, because that's exactly what they'll be doing. The next 4 hours changed everything Jake thought he knew about military planning. What started as a desperate suggestion from a nervous cadet became the most intensive strategy session in Alliance history. Admiral Sullivan had moved Jake to the main planning table right next to the senior commanders. His small tablet had been replaced with a full tactical workstation. For the first time since joining the military, Jake felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Show us the mining equipment specifications, General Cooper said, pulling up technical drawings on his screen. If we're going to turn civilian tools into weapons, we need to understand what we're working with. Jake accessed the Kepler Station database, displaying holographic models of the mining equipment. These laser cutters are designed to slice through solid rock at a molecular level. They're actually more powerful than most military weapons, just not as portable. Admiral Zhekalos studied the specifications with his compound eyes. The power requirements are enormous. They would need to be connected to the main reactor. That's not a problem, Jake replied, highlighting the station's power distribution system. Kepler Station has redundant power grids throughout the entire structure. The miners can tap into reactor power from almost anywhere. General Vextar had been quiet for the past hour, his crystal form shifting through various colors as he processed the information. Finally, he spoke. The industrial fabricators present the most interesting possibilities. They can produce weapons, but they can also produce ammunition, tools, and defensive equipment. Jake nodded enthusiastically. The fabricators normally make ship components and mining tools, but their base programming includes templates for almost everything, including military hardware. The civilians just need access codes to unlock the weapon manufacturing protocols, which we can provide. Admiral Sullivan said, Our intelligence division has override codes for most civilian fabrication systems. Jake brought up a new display showing the station's internal layout. Here's where it gets really interesting. Kepler Station wasn't just built for mining. It was built for survival. He highlighted sections of the asteroid that Jake had studied during his journey to the War Council. Emergency shelters, independent life support systems, blast doors designed to contain reactor breaches. The place is already set up to function as separate defensive zones. Admiral Cooper leaned back in his chair, studying the display. You're talking about turning each section into a fortress. Exactly, Jake said. The Zephyrians will have to fight for every level, every corridor. And while they're doing that, the civilians can hit them from directions they never expected. Jake manipulated the display to show the station's maintenance systems. Ventilation shafts, utility tunnels, cargo conveyors. The entire asteroid is connected by passages too small for Zephyrian troops, but perfect for human fighters. Guerrilla warfare in 3 dimensions, Admiral Sullivan murmured. The Zephyrians will never know where the next attack is coming from. General. Vextar's form had shifted to a bright silver color. There is one significant problem with this plan. Communication. How do we coordinate between 50 million civilians and our fleet? Jake had been thinking about that problem for the past hour. Kepler Station has a quantum communication array for their mining operations. It's designed to coordinate work crews across the entire asteroid. We can use it to create a command network. He brought up the communication system specifications. Every civilian work crew has a quantum communicator. Every residential section has emergency broadcast systems. We can establish a real-time link between the civilian fighters and our ship. Commanders. Admiral Jekalos clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. The Zephyrians will try to jam our communications. They can try, Jake said with a smile. But the quantum communicators are built into the asteroid structure. The Zephyrians would have to destroy the entire station to stop the signal, which defeats the purpose of their invasion. The planning session continued through the night. Jake found himself working directly with officers who had decades of combat experience, and they were listening to his ideas as if he were their equal. They developed contingency plans for different scenarios. What if the Zephyrians tried to bombard the station from space? The civilian fighters could threaten to destroy the industrial facilities, making the station worthless as a strategic asset. What if the enemy tried to cut off power to sections of the asteroid? The civilians could use portable fusion batteries from the mining equipment. We need to think about leadership structure, Admiral Sullivan said during a brief break. 50 million people need organization and command hierarchy. Jake accessed the station's personnel files. The mining supervisors already have experience coordinating large groups under dangerous conditions. The industrial foremen know how to manage complex operations. The emergency response teams have training in crisis situations. Natural leaders, General Cooper agreed. People the population already trusts and follows. General Vextar had been studying casualty projections for the past hour. Even with this plan, the losses will be significant. Perhaps 30% of the civilian population. Jake felt the weight of those numbers. 15 million people. But he forced himself to think about the alternative. General, if we abandon the station, the losses will be 100%. 50 million people will die, and we'll lose the industrial capacity anyway. The cadet is correct, Admiral Jekalos said. This plan gives the civilians a chance to survive. More importantly, it gives them a chance to fight back. As dawn approached on the ship's artificial day cycle, they had developed a complete battle plan. The Alliance fleet would position itself just far enough from Kepler Station to avoid the initial Zephyrian assault. When the enemy ships moved in to board the station, the civilian resistance would begin. The first phase would focus on slowing down the Zephyrian advance. Mining equipment would be used to create choke points and barriers. Fabricated weapons would be distributed to the population. Emergency systems would be activated to make the station as difficult to navigate as possible. The second phase would begin once the Zephyrians were committed to the boarding action. Civilian fighters would launch coordinated attacks from the maintenance tunnels and utility shafts. Industrial facilities would be weaponized to target enemy positions. The station's own systems would be turned against the invaders. The final phase would involve the Alliance fleet engaging the Zephyrian ships while they were distracted by the civilian resistance. With their troops trapped inside the station and their ships vulnerable to focused fire, the enemy would be forced to choose between retreat and total defeat. There's one more thing, Jake said as they finished the final details. We need to tell the people on Kepler Station what we're asking them to do. Admiral Sullivan nodded gravely. They deserve to know the risks, and they deserve to choose whether they want to fight. Jake looked around the table at the commanders who had become his partners in planning. They'll choose to fight. Humans always do when they're protecting their home. General Vextar's crystal form glowed with what Jake had learned was approval. Your confidence in your species is remarkable, Cadet Morrison. It's not confidence, Jake replied. It's knowledge. I know what humans do when their backs are against the wall. We fight. We adapt. We find ways to win that nobody else would even consider. Admiral Sullivan stood up, signaling the end of the planning session. Cadet Morrison, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to lieutenant. This plan couldn't have happened without your insight. Jake felt a surge of pride, but also responsibility. Thank you, Admiral. But the real test comes when the Zephyrians arrive. Indeed it does, she replied. In 4 days, we'll find out if a Deathworlder's perspective can change the course of this war. As the commanders dispersed to begin implementing the plan, Jake remained at the holographic display, studying Kepler Station one more time. Somewhere inside that asteroid, 50 million people were about to face the fight of their lives. But they wouldn't face it alone. For the first time in this war, humans would fight the way they had always fought best, with their backs against the wall, protecting the people they loved, using every tool and trick at their disposal. Jake smiled as he looked at tactical display. The Zephyrians had no idea what they were about to encounter. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler Station, Jake Morrison stood in the same war room where he had first found his voice. But everything had changed. The back corner where he used to sit was now occupied by other young officers, cadets, who looked at him with the same mixture of awe and nervousness he once felt toward the senior commanders. Jake wore lieutenant's bars now, but more importantly, he wore the confidence of someone who had helped change the course of a war. The battle plan he had proposed hadn't just worked. It had exceeded every expectation. When the Zephyrian fleet arrived at Kepler Station, they found exactly what they expected, a lightly defended civilian installation with minimal military presence. Their assault ships had docked with the station in 12 different locations. Exactly as the intelligence reports had predicted. What they didn't expect was what happened next. That the 50 million civilians of Kepler Station had voted unanimously to fight. When Admiral Sullivan's message reached them, explaining the plan and asking for their participation, the response had been immediate and overwhelming. Not only did they agree to defend their home, but they began preparing for battle with an enthusiasm that surprised even Jake. The mining supervisors had organized the population into fighting units based on their work crews. The industrial foremen had converted their fabrication facilities into weapons factories. The emergency response teams had established command posts throughout the station. Most importantly, they had embraced the guerrilla warfare tactics that Jake had described. Within hours of the first Zephyrian landing, the invaders found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The battle had lasted for 18 hours. Jake had watched from the Alliance Command ship as the tactical displays showed the progress of the fighting. Red dots representing Zephyrian troops advanced through the station's corridors, only to be surrounded by blue dots representing civilian fighters. Emerging from maintenance tunnels and utility shafts, the mining equipment had proven even more effective than Jake had predicted. Laser cutters designed to slice through solid rock made short work of Zephyrian body armor. Explosive charges meant for asteroid mining created devastating traps in the station's narrow passages. But it was the human spirit that made the real difference. The civilians didn't just fight. They fought with a ferocity that the Zephyrians had never encountered before. They turned every room into a fortress, every corridor into a killing field, every maintenance shaft into an ambush point. The Zephyrian assault troops, trained for quick victories against organized military forces, found themselves completely unprepared for the chaos of urban warfare against a population that refused to surrender. Their commanders, watching their forces become bogged down in endless firefights, were forced to commit more and more troops to the boarding action. That's when the Alliance fleet struck, with the Zephyrian ships locked in position to support. Their ground assault, Admiral Sullivan's forces had moved in for the kill. The enemy fleet, caught between their commitment to the ground battle and the need to defend their ships, had been destroyed piece by piece. Of the original Zephyrian invasion force, less than 10% had survived to retreat. The civilian casualties on Kepler Station had been heavy. Nearly 12 million people had died in the fighting, but 38 million had survived, and they had done so by winning the battle themselves. Now Jake stood before a new war council, this one, including representatives from species that had never worked with the Alliance before. Word of the victory at Kepler Station had spread across the galaxy like wildfire. For the first time in decades, someone had not just stopped the Zephyrian advance, but had completely destroyed an invasion fleet. The new strategy that Jake had proposed was being implemented on dozens of worlds. The Alliance had established the Asymmetric Warfare Division, with Jake as one of its primary advisors, despite his young age. The concept of turning civilian populations into strategic assets rather than liabilities had revolutionized how the galaxy thought about defense. Lieutenant Morrison, Admiral Sullivan said, addressing the assembled commanders, "Please brief our new allies on the Kepler Station protocols." Jake moved to the holographic display with the same confidence he had once lacked. The nervous cadet who had been afraid to speak was gone, replaced by an officer who understood that sometimes the most important voice in the room belonged to someone who saw things differently. The key to defending against Zephyrian assault is understanding what they expect, Jake began, addressing representatives from 6 different species. They've built their entire military doctrine around quick victories against conventional forces or helpless civilians. When you give them something in between, they don't know how to respond. A crystalline being from the Vorthan Consortium raised a limb in question. Our civilian populations lack the industrial capacity of Kepler Station. How can this strategy be adapted? Jake smiled, remembering when he would have been too intimidated to answer such a question. Every world has resources that can be weaponized. Agricultural equipment, construction tools, transportation systems. The principle is the same. You use what you have to fight in ways the enemy doesn't expect. Over the past 3 months, Jake had helped develop defense plans for 17 different worlds. Each one was unique, adapted to the local population and available resources. On agricultural worlds, farming equipment became weapons and irrigation systems became defensive networks. On manufacturing planets, assembly lines were converted to produce arms and armor, but the real revolution wasn't in the technology. It was in the mindset. The most important change, Jake continued, is helping civilian populations understand that they're not helpless. When people know they can fight back, when they have the tools and training to defend themselves, they become something the Zephyrians have never learned to handle. Admiral Zhikalos, who had become one of Jake's strongest supporters, clicked his mandibles in agreement. The psychological impact has been as significant as the tactical advantages. Zephyrian forces now approach civilian targets with uncertainty rather than confidence. General Vextar, his crystal form glowing with approval, added his own observation. Intelligence reports indicate that the Zephyrian Empire is restructuring their military doctrine. They are developing new strategies specifically to counter human-style resistance. Good, Jake said firmly. Let them change their plans. Every time they adapt to one approach, we'll develop another. That's what humans do. We adapt faster than our enemies can keep up. The War Council continued for several more hours, but Jake's mind wandered to the reports he had been reading from other battlefields. The victory at Kepler Station hadn't just saved 50 million lives. It had inspired resistance movements across the galaxy. On Proxima 7, a mining colony had used their equipment to create underground bunkers that had held off a Zephyrian siege for 2 months. On New Geneva, civilians had turned their city's transportation system into a trap that had destroyed an entire enemy division. Most importantly, species that had never worked together before were now sharing tactics and strategies. The Altarians were teaching other races about defensive crystal formations. The Centauri were sharing their knowledge of tunnel warfare. Humans were spreading the concept of asymmetric resistance. As the council session ended, Admiral Sullivan approached Jake privately. "I have news from Earth," she said. "The Planetary Defense Council wants to speak with you." Jake felt a surge of homesickness mixed with pride. "What do they want?" "They want you to help establish a new training academy," Admiral Sullivan replied. "A place where military officers from across the galaxy can learn about unconventional warfare. They're calling it the Morrison Institute." Jake stared at her in shock. "They want to name it after me?" "You changed how an entire galaxy thinks about warfare," she said gently. One moment of courage in a war room led to the development of strategies that have saved millions of lives. I'd say that deserves recognition. As Jake walked back to his quarters, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he had been a quiet cadet who was afraid to speak up in meetings. Now he was helping to train commanders from dozens of different species. But the most important change wasn't in his rank or his responsibilities. It was in his understanding of what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of different kinds of intelligence. Humans weren't the strongest species, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced. What made humans special was their refusal to accept that some problems had no solutions. When other species saw impossible odds, humans saw challenges to overcome. When others calculated acceptable losses, humans found ways to save everyone. Jake paused at the viewing port in the corridor outside his quarters. Through the transparent metal, he could see the stars that marked the locations of worlds where human-inspired resistance was taking root. Each point of light represented millions of people who now knew they didn't have to be victims. The war against the Zephyrian Empire was far from over. But for the first time since it began, the outcome was no longer certain. The galaxy had learned something that humans had always known. When you're fighting for your home, for your family, for everything you care about, you find ways to win that nobody thought